So at this point, our panel is prepared to take your questions. And if you're joining us by webcast, this is a new thing. So you'll be submitting your questions by email, and someone will be printing them out and bringing them to me here at the podium, and I'll ask them on your behalf. So questions, Mike.
I'd like to ask you your assessment of what's happened in commodity markets over the last couple of days. It's been a lot of volatility, and there seems to be the sense among market participants that we've turned a point with oil prices that perhaps the worst of this commodity price surge is over. What do you think about it?
I think I would never comment on short-term market price movements, and I don't think today is a good place to start. What matters for us is the medium to longer-term trends in commodity prices and how those price trends get incorporated into inflation expectations. And I would be hesitant to put very much weight on very near-term developments in terms of that changing the picture dramatically in terms of those broader issues. So we'll see how things go. I mean, commodity prices are very volatile, as we've definitely seen over the last few days. And the key question will be whether the price increases that we've seen in commodity prices turn out to be transitory, which is what our expectation is. If they are, then inflation is not going to be a big risk, and we can really keep focused on the other part of our mandate where we're missing quite badly, which is how far we are away from maximum employment.
Caroline?
Just to follow up on that, how closely are you watching inflation expectations? How important are they as an indicator right now? And to what extent do you think they reflect the Fed's credibility?
I think we're getting very close to monetary policy. But as I have said, and as the chairman has said, inflation expectations are something that we monitor very closely. We really do want to make sure, as I said in my remarks, want to be very sure that inflation expectations remain well anchored. Our current assessment of inflation expectations is that they are well anchored, but we're going to monitor that because if they were to become unmoored, that would run much greater risk in terms of actual inflation.
So we have a question from James Matter. He's an economics writer with Newsday. He says, I'm wondering about Long Island. What is the employment outlook? Does Long Island trend New York City and New York State? If it differs, how?
Okay, so one of the interesting things about Long Island is that it wasn't it hit as hard in the downturn, and it's outperformed pretty well in the upturn. And if you look at the actual sectors where it's doing particularly well, a lot of it is in education and health, particularly in healthcare. And this is more so than in the rest of the region. You've also seen fewer job losses in state and local government in Long Island thus far than you have in the rest of the region. But again, the same risks going forward for Long Island that apply to the region. And of course, the big one is state and local government, because there's a lot of fiscal stress in Long Island itself, in addition to just at the state and local level generally. And then the other thing I think that's sort of on the plus side, based on just the upward momentum you see, is that Long Island's economy is tied fairly closely to New York City's, and in addition, Long Island has basically a lot of people commute to New York City, and its economy tends to be pretty well correlated with New York City's, and so the strength in New York City's economy, although it's not a magic bullet for Long Island, it certainly does help. So it's basically a mixed picture, I guess.
Other questions? Claudia.
Hi there. Claudia Hirsch, Market News. Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah, it pains me not to ask you about monetary policy, but I will. I'll turn to manufacturing.
I share your pain.
Regionally, and what you can speak of nationally in the reports you're hearing from manufacturers, I'm curious. It's important. Manufacturing is especially important because of the multiplier effect on job creation going forward in a way that the service sector isn't. So, is job creation in the manufacturing sector reflecting merely customers' inventory catch-up, or is there evidence that the manufacturing sector is ginning up further as customers' demand organically grows? And separately, is there evidence from regional or national manufacturers that there is backshoring going on of manufacturing processes from Asia to the U.S., and is there some momentum in that trend?
Okay, well, I think the first thing we could say is that the manufacturing job trends have actually been one of the bright spots. Manufacturing employment has declined for, many decades actually, and part of that's due to manufacturing jobs being relocated overseas. Part of it's due to the fact that productivity in manufacturing is very high relative to productivity in the overall economy. And what we've actually seen very, very good job performance in manufacturing. Now, some of it's probably due to the inventory rebuilding that you mentioned, but I think that there's something more persistent going on here, which is the fact that productivity growth in the U.S. has been very, very strong, and so we're actually pretty competitive in global markets. And you're right, there has been some evidence of people moving activity back to the U.S. GE announced a while back that they were moving back their appliance operation that was in Mexico back to the United States, and I think there's probably other examples of that. So I think generally the fact that the rest of the world is growing pretty fast too, and the emerging markets particularly are growing very fast, also I think is helpful in terms of providing support to U.S. manufacturing. So I think generally it's a bright spot in what has been a jobs picture that has been somewhat disappointing relative to what we would like to see occurring.
Is there evidence to suggest, if you wouldn't mind a follow-up, evidence that manufacturing employment might be accelerating in the coming months?
I think it's been pretty strong. If you look at the most current numbers that we have are the ISM manufacturing survey, and that's was a touch off its peak in May, but it remains above a reading of 60. So it certainly suggests that the manufacturing sector is pretty vigorous. I mean, an ISM reading of 60 is actually very strong relative to the actual GDP numbers that we're seeing. So I think it does tell you that manufacturing has quite a bit of forward momentum.
And just briefly, in New York State, we have our Empire State Manufacturing Survey has been showing fairly positive readings on employment recently as well. So even in New York State, where employment has this sort of underlying downtrend long term, it seems to be less negative than usual.
Kevin Mead is a reporter with Caribbean Business joining us from San Juan, Puerto Rico. He's asking, what are the signs of stabilization in Puerto Rico?
Should I take? Okay.
Sure. Jason, thank you.
Okay, that's a great question. Well, the main sign of stabilizations are there are two, basically. There's a coincident index for Puerto Rico that seems to have leveled off. It edged down a little bit since between last July and early this year, but not at anywhere near the rate that you saw during the recession. And in the last couple of months, it's been kind of steady. And in addition, you have a government employment leveled off since the middle of last year, and private sector employment has edged up from its lows last year. So basically, both government and private sector employment have leveled off. This coincident index, which to some extent includes that, has leveled off. And I should add that there's a manufacturing survey that's recently been started in Puerto Rico, and that's showing some strength. Again, this has been a sector just like in our region and in many areas that was very hard hit. In Puerto Rico, it's more important than in much of our region. And so this manufacturing survey bodes well. It's promising. It may not reflect what's happened yet, but so these are sort of the signs of stabilization in Puerto Rico, basically.
Other questions? Yes, Lisa.
Lisa Chow, New York Public Radio. I'm just wondering, in terms of the graph, looking at the the Wall Street versus Main Street issue, so it looks like the gap is shrinking over time, and then it turned kind of positive in the sense of Main Street came ahead of Wall Street. But I guess I want to know more about what that means, and what do you take that as a sign, good sign, bad sign?
I mean, it's probably important not to read too much into that, given that you don't have that many observations, not that many business cycles. But I think what my takeaway from all the evidence that was presented is that the New York City economy is becoming more diversified, And I think, people who've been in the city for many, many decades would tell you that the city is, in very good shape, very attractive. And I think the pickup you see in things like, eating and drinking and, establishments and things like that show you that the city is now very attractive from a tourist perspective. And Emily Rafferty, who's the head of the Metropolitan Museums, on our board of directors, and she's told us that things are gangbusters in terms of people visiting from abroad to New York City, and that's a huge benefit. So I think the economy is becoming a little bit more diversified, a little bit less dependent on the finance sector we might take.
Yeah, I mean, that pretty well sums it up. I think in the past, New York City has typically lagged the U.S. as a whole coming out of recessions, and so the finance sector is sort of the channel by which economic strength at the national level, tends to work its way through the city. And I think President Dudley's exactly right, that the fundamentals of New York City are playing more of a role than this sort of securities industry, which is obviously based on global trends and things. The other thing is that back office, in the past, a lot of the movement was in back office jobs. And now I think more of the employment in that industry in New York City reflects the I guess, front office jobs, if you will.
I'm just a
Quick
follow-up to that. Of course, though, in this particular downturn, New York City really benefited from TARP. I'd say probably more significantly, TARP, all of the bailout money, and the securities industry really benefited from it. So I'm wondering, how does that, how do you incorporate that into this understanding?
Well, I mean, obviously, a lot of the extraordinary interventions were designed to prevent the collapse of the financial system, and the reason for that was not just prevent the collapse of the financial system, but was prevent the consequences of the collapse of the financial system and the ability of Main Street to get credit to finance economic activity. So you're absolutely right. There's no question that the financial sector benefited from those interventions, but the goal of those interventions wasn't oriented towards the financial sector per se. It was oriented towards stabilizing the broader economy, ensuring that the flow of credit to households and business was going to be maintained.
Right, I guess I'm just...
If we can move on to the next question. Sorry, Lisa. We have a question from Hugh Morley at the Bergen Record. This one's directed at Jason Bram on the online ad listing slide that you showed. New Jersey's increase of 8% is significantly smaller than New York State and the U.S. Why is that? Presumably it is not affected by the bigger government job loss that has held New Jersey's rebound back in other areas.
What was the very last part?
Question.
The government?
Presumably it is not affected by the bigger government job loss that has held New Jersey's rebound back in other areas.
Oh, no, I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case at all, because, companies are constantly, there's a lot of churning going on. And so if government's cutting back funds and cutting back employment themselves, that will probably be a source of, weakness. And, for example, it's not adding to the... We looked at more occupations than these. So, for example, one of the occupations that was contributed positively, not hugely, but positively in New York, but negatively in New Jersey, was education. And we know that New Jersey has cut back a lot on education expenditures and so forth. So I do, it's hard to say because we don't have the information by industry crossed with occupation, but I think it just reflects the fact that part of it is probably related to the government, and part of it is simply related to the fact that there are fewer sectors, as we saw in one of those slides, which I guess we can look at later. But one of the slides which showed that the gains in New Jersey tend to be more limited to professional business services, not as broad-based as in the broader economy. So, I think basically the weaker increase in job ads in New Jersey reflects the fact that the employment trends and labor demand growth has, been not as strong in New Jersey as in New York.
I think with one clarification, are government jobs included in those listings? I think they probably are, right?
Oh, yes, government jobs, I believe, are included in those listings.
That weakness might reflect in part fewer listings within government as well.
Yes, that's right.
Unrelated to
Lisa, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, can you talk a little bit about the disconnect between profits and job growth? I mean, the stock market is at kind of pre-crash levels, and unemployment is still at 9%. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. What you make of that?
Well, the one thing that was very noteworthy about the United States during the economic downturn relative to other countries was the fact that businesses in the United States were very aggressively about shedding jobs. And as a consequence, productivity growth through the downturn into the early stages of the recovery was extraordinarily strong. And I think it's that productivity growth that's really essentially supported profit margins. And so that's number one. Number two, in a situation where the unemployment rate is high, the bargaining power of labor with business isn't very good. And so that's also probably supports the profit margins relative to labor. Now, obviously, our goal at the Federal Reserve is to generate stronger job growth over time. And when that happens, that will probably change that sort of bargaining dynamic between business and labor somewhat.
So we have a question from Danny Massey at Crane's New York Business. Wall Street employment has rebounded a bit. Is this trend going to continue, or is uneasiness over regulatory reform going to result in a leaner securities industry?
I think that's one of those kind of speculative questions that's very, very difficult to answer. I think it's fair to say that the regulatory initiatives that have been undertaken, still have a ways to run and play out, and the implications for financial firms' business models isn't fully understood at this point. But how that evolves and whether it's good or bad for individual firms, I think it's too early to really speculate about that. I think we can say that New York City is the major financial center in the world. Basically fighting it out with London for preeminence. I don't see anything that's going to change that over the medium to longer term run, as long as we implement regulatory policy in a way that's a level playing field across the globe, and that's very much our goal.
Thank you. Michael Diamond, reporter with the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey. Can you explain where you think the housing sector is in terms of the recovery? I assume in New Jersey.
New Jersey?
I guess when we look at New Jersey, and we saw a lot of similarities in the economy of New Jersey with the nation, it's the first thing that we look at in that consideration is the housing market in this cycle. And so what I can say is that it looks like the parts of northern New Jersey are pretty much tracking the nation, both in terms of home prices and also in terms of things like the penetration of non-prime lending and delinquency rates. They're in those areas, they're roughly on a par with the nation, and I think in terms of economic performance, again, the first thing looking to the housing market, that's where you're seeing New Jersey look a lot like the nation, because it has a lot of the same characteristics in terms of the degree of the degree of penetration of subprime lending, home prices. So in terms of to the extent that it's going to reflect job growth, our outlook is, again, for moderate job growth. We think, just to repeat again, the service sector is going to be important, and that's to the extent that we generate additional jobs, it's going to generate additional demand. But at the same time, the state and local government is going to, to date has held back growth. And so I think the best thing that's going to happen is that job growth continues, and that's going to support the housing market.
Yeah, I think it's really important that if we get stronger employment growth, we'll get more household formation, and we get more household formation, that'll increase the demand for housing, and that will start to absorb the supply that's being created by the foreclosure pipeline.
Caroline, Bloomberg.
Just a follow-up to Claudia's question earlier, you mentioned U.S. competitiveness, and you also noted exports as a positive in your speech. Could you speak a little bit about how big a role you think that is going to play as we continue on this recovery?
It's hard to say, exactly how big a positive it will be, but I think it is an important part of rebalancing the global economy. Where if you look at what happened during the boom, consumption as a share of GDP got very, very high, and the U.S. ran a persistent and fairly large trade deficit. And I think part of sustainable global growth is to see U.S. consumption as a somewhat lower share of GDP, and we've already seen that happen. Another aspect of it is to see the U.S. trade deficit come down. And if you actually look at the non-oil trade balance in the U.S., so you just take out oil, which is so affected by the run-up in oil prices, we're actually seeing pretty substantial improvement in the non-oil trade balance. So I think it's definitely going to be a positive for the outlook. I think the question is how big, the degree, I think, to be determined.
Mike?
Yeah, in light of today's focus on employment and the release of the forecasts last week at the FOMC meeting, what is your outlook for the unemployment rate towards the end of the year? And would you say what your forecasts were that you provided as part of the central tendencies?
I mean, we're, as I've said, I'll just say, just sort of generally, that we do expect payroll employment growth to continue to pick up speed over the next 6 months, year, 2 years. That's something that we want to see happen. But I'm not going to give you a forecast in terms of the precise unemployment rate. We've seen just in the last 6 months how volatile unemployment rates can be, based on participation rates and people who enter or leave the labor force. So giving you a point forecast, I think that would be a mistake.
Okay, we have another question from James Matter at Newsday. New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli last week released a report showing the gross metropolitan product in 2010 for upstate metro areas was much stronger than New York City or Long Island, even though unemployment was much higher upstate. Could you explain why there seems to be a disconnect between employment growth and gross metropolitan product? Rich.
Gave me the tough one. Yeah, I'm not quite sure, honestly.
So
we'll look into
it, James.
Try
We'll
to see.
We'll get back to you.
I'm not familiar exactly with the report at this point, so it's hard for me to comment on.
We're not sure what the time period is, because the time period is really important.
We'll get back to you, James. Any other questions? Okay. We'd like to thank everyone joining us here in the room today and on the webcast. I'd like to remind folks that Monday at 10 a.m. the bank will be releasing our quarterly report on household debt and credit. Mark your calendars. We'll do a technical briefing call for you guys a little bit earlier, 9:15 on Monday. You'll be hearing from me. All the materials from today's press briefing will be on our website, as you can expect. And if you have any questions one-on-one for our economists here afterwards, if you're joining by webcast, feel free to give me a call. If you're here in the room, feel free to come up and we can help you do an interview here. Thank you very much.